In the dense forests of Montana, a 3-year-old boy vanished without a trace. But when rescuers finally located him, they were frozen in their tracks. A 500-pound grizzly bear was standing guard over the child. What happened next would challenge everything we thought we knew about wild animals. It was a crisp September morning at the Pine Creek Campground, the kind that Montana locals call perfect camping weather. The Thompson family, Mark, Sarah, and their energetic 3-year-old, Casey, had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for months. The campground, nestled in the heart of the Gallatin National Forest, was known for its pristine beauty and abundant wildlife, though the latter would soon take on a whole new meaning for the Thompsons. Mark Thompson, a local construction worker, had grown up camping in these woods and wanted to pass that love of nature on to his son. Sarah, despite being relatively new to camping, shared her husband's enthusiasm for giving Casey an outdoor education. They'd chosen Pine Creek specifically for its family-friendly reputation and well-maintained facilities. Casey was in his element that morning, Sarah would later recall, her voice trembling during the first of many interviews. He was running around, pointing at birds, collecting pine cones, just being a typical curious 3-year-old. The campsite was coming alive with the sounds of breakfast preparation, the crackle of morning campfires, and the distant calls of early rising birds. The events that followed would later be scrutinized by everyone from local law enforcement to wildlife behavioral experts. At approximately 7:15 a.m., Mark was tending to the campfire while Sarah organized their cooking supplies. Casey was playing near their tent, no more than 15 feet away. The couple had developed what they thought was a foolproof system. One parent would always have eyes on Casey while the other handled camp duties. But in the wilderness, even foolproof systems can fail in the blink of an eye. The first sign that something was wrong came when Sarah turned to ask Casey if he wanted blueberries in his oatmeal. The space where he had been playing just moments before was empty. "Casey," she called out, her voice still casual, still believing he was just behind the tent or crouched behind a nearby tree. Mark looked up from the fire, the first flickers of concern crossing his face. What followed was 5 minutes of increasingly panicked searching around their immediate campsite. 5 minutes became 10, and the Thompsons' calls grew more desperate. Other campers began emerging from their sites, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Robert Martinez, an off-duty park ranger who immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. "Time is critical in these cases," Martinez would later explain. "In wilderness situations involving small children, the first hour is crucial. They can cover surprising distances, especially if they're following something that catches their interest." Martinez immediately called in to park headquarters, setting in motion what would become one of the largest search operations in the area's history. As news of the missing child spread through the campground, a remarkable scene began to unfold. Campers abandoned their breakfast plans and morning activities, organizing themselves into search parties. Local hunting guide Mike Peterson, who happened to be at the campground that morning, began marking out search grids on a map, drawing on his decades of experience tracking game through these woods. But none of these well-intentioned searchers could have imagined what they were actually looking for. None of them knew that little Casey Thompson's disappearance would soon challenge everything they thought they knew about wilderness survival and the complex relationship between humans and wild animals. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Montana sky, no one suspected that this story would become one that would be told and retold for generations to come. The clock was ticking, and somewhere in the vast wilderness, forces beyond anyone's understanding were already in motion. The first rays of sunlight had barely touched the mountaintops when the search operation kicked into high gear. Park rangers, having dealt with missing persons before, knew that the dense Montana wilderness could swallow up even the most experienced hikers. let alone a 3-year-old boy. The initial search radius was set at 2 miles from the campsite, a distance that seemed impossibly large for such tiny legs to cover. Sarah Thompson sat in the ranger station, clutching Casey's favorite stuffed dinosaur, her eyes fixed on the growing number of search vehicles arriving in the parking lot. Mark paced outside, providing details to anyone who would listen. Casey was wearing red overalls, a blue striped t-shirt, and light-up sneakers. "He's afraid of the dark," Mark kept repeating, his voice cracking. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Now back to the story." He's never been alone in the dark. Local wildlife expert Dr. Catherine Chen arrived on scene, her presence standard procedure in wilderness searches. These woods were home to mountain lions, wolves, and yes, grizzly bears. While attacks were rare, the possibility couldn't be ignored. In most cases, Dr. Chen would later write in her report, predators avoid human children. Their erratic movements and high-pitched voices usually act as deterrents. But in this case, that knowledge provided little comfort. The search teams spread out in a carefully coordinated pattern, each group equipped with radio communications and GPS tracking devices. Search dogs picked up Casey's scent from the campsite, but the trails seemed to lead in conflicting directions. The morning dew had already begun to evaporate, taking with it crucial tracking conditions. As noon approached, helicopter support arrived from Helena, its rhythmic beating echoing through the valleys. Thermal imaging cameras scanned the forest canopy, searching for any sign of human heat signatures. The technology was advanced, but the dense forest cover made it difficult to distinguish between wildlife and human presence. Local news crews began arriving, setting up their equipment at the ranger station. The story of a missing child in grizzly country was already capturing national attention. But none of these seasoned journalists could have predicted the extraordinary twist this story was about to take. By mid-afternoon, the search had expanded to include cave systems and water features. Every hour that passed increased both the urgency and the dread. The temperature was dropping, and weather reports warned of an approaching cold front. If Casey wasn't found before nightfall, his chances of survival would plummet. What no one realized was that fate had already intervened, in a way that would soon challenge everything they thought they knew about wilderness survival and the natural order of things. As the search teams pushed further into the wilderness, they were about to stumble upon something that would make headlines around the world and change our understanding of wild animal behavior forever. As dusk approached on the first day, the search teams made a discovery that sent ripples of both hope and fear through the rescue operation. Near a steep ravine, about 3 miles from the campsite, they found one of Casey's light-up sneakers. Beside it, clearly visible in the soft earth, were tracks that made the blood drain from even the most experienced rangers' faces. Grizzly bear prints, massive ones, overlapping with tiny human footprints. The discovery transformed the entire nature of the search. Dr. Chen immediately called for additional wildlife experts and tranquilizer equipment. At this point, she would later testify, we were operating under the assumption that we were dealing with a worst-case scenario. The parents were quietly moved back to the ranger station, though Sarah had to be practically carried away, screaming that she needed to be part of the search. Night fell over the Montana wilderness, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that seemed to mock the searchers' efforts. The helicopter was grounded due to poor visibility, but the ground teams continued with their powerful spotlights cutting through the darkness. Nobody spoke about the odds of a 3-year-old surviving a night in these conditions. Nobody had to. Local Blackfeet tribal elder Joseph Running Wolf arrived at the ranger station shortly before midnight. He had heard about the bear tracks and insisted on joining the search. "Bears are not what you think they are," he told the skeptical rangers. "They carry ancient wisdom. Sometimes they do things your science cannot explain." His words would prove eerily prophetic. The search teams worked in shifts through the night, their flashlight beams dancing through the trees like desperate fireflies. The weather was deteriorating, with a light drizzle beginning to fall. The temperature dropped to near freezing, and the thought of little Casey out there alone was almost unbearable for the searchers. Dawn of the second day broke with a thick fog that seemed to swallow sound itself. The mood at base camp was grim. Statistics showed that after 24 hours, the chances of finding a lost child alive dropped dramatically. But then came the radio call that would change everything. Team Delta, searching the northern quadrant, had found fresh bear tracks. These weren't just passing prints, they showed a deliberate path, with the same bear circling back multiple times to the same location. More surprisingly, they found small pieces of Casey's red overalls caught on branches, following the same path as the bear tracks. Dr. Chen's face went pale as she studied the patterns. "In 20 years of wildlife study, I've never seen anything like this," she whispered to her colleague. "It's almost as if the bear is maintaining a patrol pattern." The implications were too bizarre to consider, yet the evidence was right there in the mud before them. What they didn't know then was that they were about to stumble upon something that would challenge every textbook ever written about ursine behavior. Something that would make headlines around the world and force scientists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. The fog was beginning to lift when Ana Martinez, one of the most experienced trackers on the search team, spotted something through her binoculars that made her question her own sanity. In a small clearing about half a mile ahead, she saw movement. But not the frantic movement of a scared child or the aggressive stance of a predator. What she saw defied explanation. Through the morning mist, she could make out the massive form of a grizzly bear, easily 500 pounds, moving with deliberate care around a small, red-clad figure. Casey was there, alive, and the bear wasn't attacking. It was standing guard. Martinez's hands shook so badly she almost dropped her radio as she called it in. "Base, this is Martinez," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I have visual confirmation on the child and you're not going to believe this. We need Dr. Chen here. Immediately. No sudden movements, no helicopters, no loud noises. Something incredible is happening." The response team assembled with unprecedented speed and silence. Dr. Chen arrived with her tranquilizer gun, but upon witnessing the scene, slowly lowered it. The bear was performing a behavior she had only seen mothers do with their cubs. It was positioning itself between Casey and any perceived threats, including the direction of the rescue team. Casey incredibly showed no signs of fear. He was sitting on a bed of moss, playing with pine cones, occasionally looking up at his massive guardian as if checking that it was still there. The bear would periodically scan the surroundings, its powerful nose testing the air, its ears constantly moving to track any potential threats. The rescue team found themselves in completely uncharted territory. Standard protocol for bear encounters was useless here. Any attempt to scare the bear away could put Casey at risk, but leaving him there wasn't an option either. The temperature was still dangerously low, and despite appearing unharmed, the child needed immediate medical attention. Dr. Chen made a controversial decision. "We need the parents," she whispered, "but only Sarah. A mother's voice might be our best chance." The team debated frantically. Bringing a parent this close to a grizzly bear seemed like madness, but they were out of options and running out of time. Sarah Thompson arrived 30 minutes later, having been rapidly but quietly escorted through the woods. When she saw her son sitting calmly next to one of the largest predators in North America, she had to bite her hand to keep from screaming. Dr. Chen gripped her arm firmly and whispered instructions. "Speak softly. Call to him calmly. Don't run, no matter what happens." Sarah's voice trembled as she called out, "Casey, baby, it's Mommy." The bear's head snapped up, nostrils flaring. Everyone held their breath. Casey looked up, his face breaking into a smile. "Mommy!" he called back, standing up. The bear turned its massive head toward Sarah, and in that moment time seemed to stop. What happened next would be debated in scientific circles for years to come. The bear looked at Sarah, then at Casey, then back at Sarah. Slowly, deliberately, it took 2 steps away from the child. It was as if the creature understood that its job was done, that the human mother was here to reclaim her child. Sarah started singing, "You Are My Sunshine," the lullaby she sang to Casey every night. The bear's posture relaxed slightly. 2 more steps back. Casey started walking toward his mother's voice, and the bear, incredibly, let him go. The entire rescue team watched in awe as the 3-year-old toddled across the clearing and into his mother's arms. The bear remained where it was, watching. Only when Sarah had Casey safely in her embrace did the massive creature turn and lumber away into the forest, disappearing as mysteriously as it had appeared. The moment it was gone, the clearing erupted in silent tears and trembling hugs as the rescue team realized they had just witnessed something unprecedented in recorded history. The medical tent at base camp buzzed with activity as doctors examined Casey Thompson. To everyone's astonishment, the 3-year-old was in remarkably good condition. Dr. Rachel Weber, the lead pediatrician, found only minor scratches and mild dehydration, a miracle considering he had spent nearly 48 hours in the wilderness. "Physically, he's fine," Dr. Weber reported to the anxious parents. "But what's truly extraordinary is his mental state. He's not traumatized. If anything, he seems happy." Indeed, Casey sat on the examination table, happily munching on crackers and telling anyone who would listen about his big, fuzzy friend. Through his toddler's limited vocabulary and, with the help of child psychologist Dr. Marcus Chen, a picture began to emerge of Casey's time with the bear. "Bear soft," he kept saying. "Bear warm." He described how he had been cold and crying when the bear first found him, and how the massive creature had led him to a sheltered area away from the wind. The most fascinating detail came when Casey described sleeping. He made a gesture of curling up and said, "Like baby bears." Dr. Chen's eyes widened as he realized what the child was telling them. The grizzly had allowed Casey to sleep next. Do it, sharing its body heat through the freezing mountain night. Such behavior was unprecedented in documented bear-human interactions. Sarah Thompson hadn't let go of her son since the rescue. "I keep thinking this is a dream," she whispered, running her fingers through Casey's hair. "All those horrible stories. You hear about bears, and then this. It's like a miracle." Mark Thompson stood nearby, still visibly shaken, alternating between tears of joy and stunned silence. Outside the medical tent, a different kind of examination was taking place. Dr. Catherine Chen and her team were studying the bear tracks and the site where Casey had been found. They discovered something remarkable. The bear had created what they termed a safe zone. In a rough circle around where Casey had been kept, they found evidence of the bear marking trees and clearing debris, behavior typically associated with protecting cubs. "What we're seeing here challenges everything we know about ursine behavior," Dr. Chen explained to her colleagues. "This bear wasn't just tolerating Casey's presence, it was actively caring for him. The tracks show it made regular patrols around the perimeter. It even appears to have gathered softer materials, like moss, where Casey slept." News helicopters circled overhead as word of the miraculous rescue spread. Journalists from around the world were already descending on the small Montana town, all desperate to tell the story of the guardian grizzly, as it was quickly dubbed by the media. Wildlife experts from as far away as Russia and Japan were booking flights to study the phenomenon. The local Blackfeet tribal elders, led by Joseph Running Wolf, arrived to perform a ceremony of gratitude. "This is a sacred thing that has happened, I hear," Running Wolf explained to the gathered crowd. "In our stories, the bear is a teacher, a protector. Today, this bear has reminded us of an ancient truth, that the natural world holds mysteries we have forgotten." As evening approached, Casey finally fell asleep in his mother's arms, exhausted from the excitement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Weber insisted on keeping him overnight for observation, though she admitted it was more for the parents' peace of mind than medical necessity. The bear's vital signs were remarkably stable. But as the initial euphoria of the rescue began to fade, questions started emerging. Why had this bear, against all known instincts, chosen to protect rather than harm a human child? Was there something special about Casey? Or was this evidence of a level of ursine intelligence and empathy that science had never recognized? And perhaps most importantly, what would this mean for our understanding of the relationship between humans and wild animals? The answers to these questions would emerge in the days and weeks to come as researchers began to piece together one of the most extraordinary stories of interspecies compassion ever documented. Within days of Casey's rescue, the small Montana town transformed into an impromptu research center. Wildlife biologists, animal behaviorists, and researchers from prestigious institutions worldwide converged to study what they were calling the Thompson bear phenomenon. The local motel, usually quiet in the off-season, now housed scientists from Oxford, Harvard, and the Jane Goodall Institute. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a leading expert in ursine behavior from the University of British Columbia, led the primary research team. Their first priority was locating and identifying the bear that had protected Casey. Using DNA samples from fur left at the site and distinctive paw print measurements, they made a stunning discovery. "The bear is known to us," Dr. Vasquez announced at a hastily assembled press conference. "We've been tracking her for 7 years. Her designation is GF142, but local rangers know her as Grace. She's a 12-year-old female who lost her in cubs to a male bear last spring." The revelation added another layer of complexity to the already extraordinary story. Security camera footage from various hiking trails previously overlooked now proved invaluable. Researchers pieced together Grace's movements in the weeks before encountering Casey. The footage revealed something remarkable. She'd been exhibiting unusual behavior even before meeting the boy, showing uncharacteristic gentleness toward smaller animals. Dr. James Morrison, a neuroscientist specializing in animal cognition, proposed a controversial theory. The loss of her cubs may have triggered a maternal response when she encountered Casey, he explained. But this goes beyond simple instinct. The level of care she demonstrated suggests conscious decision-making and emotional intelligence we've never previously attributed to bears. The media coverage reached fever pitch when Casey's first detailed medical reports were released. The child hadn't just survived. He had been kept warm, relatively clean, and showed signs of attempted feeding. Partially digested berries found in his system matched those that bears typically gather for their cubs. Grace had apparently tried to provide him with appropriate food. Sarah Thompson's interviews became some of the most watched segments on national news. "Everyone asks if I'm angry at Grace for taking my son," she said, tears in her eyes. "But she didn't take him. She saved him. She protected him when I couldn't. How do you thank someone for something like that?" Local wildlife authorities faced a unique challenge. Grace had become an international sensation, with tourists flooding the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mother bear. Park rangers had to establish new protocols to protect both the bear and eager visitors. Dr. Chen worked with them to create a special protected zone around Grace's known territory. The scientific implications extended far beyond this single incident. Research teams began reviewing other documented cases of wild animals showing unusual behavior toward human children. A database was established, collecting stories from around the world that had previously been dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. Perhaps most significantly, the incident sparked a fierce debate about animal consciousness and emotional capacity. Dr. Sarah Richardson, a prominent animal psychologist, argued that the traditional scientific view of wild animals needed radical revision. "We've been too quick to dismiss animal intelligence as mere instinct," she wrote in a viral article. The Thompson case suggests levels of decision-making and empathy that our current models simply can't explain. Casey, meanwhile, remained remarkably unchanged by his brush with fame. In supervised sessions with child psychologists, he continued to speak about Grace with pure affection, showing none of the fear or trauma experts had expected. He drew pictures of his time with her, crude crayon drawings that would later be studied by both wildlife experts and child development specialists. The investigation was about to take another unexpected turn when trail cameras captured new footage of Grace exhibiting more unusual behavior. The bear that had challenged everything we thought we knew about wild animals wasn't done surprising us. As researchers would soon discover, the story of Casey and Grace was far from over. It was about to reveal something even more extraordinary about the hidden emotional lives of wild animals. The new trail camera footage stunned even the most seasoned researchers. Grace had been observed returning repeatedly to the clearing where she had protected Casey, exhibiting what Dr. Vasquez termed memorial behavior. She would spend hours in the area, often bringing pine cones similar to those she had watched Casey play with. The behavior was unprecedented in documented ursine studies. More remarkably, Grace's interaction with other bears had changed dramatically. Trail cameras captured her intervening when a younger bear showed aggression toward a lost deer fawn. Instead of displaying typical predatory behavior, she guided the fawn back toward an area where deer were commonly seen. The footage sent ripples through the scientific community. What we're witnessing is a fundamental shift in behavioral patterns, Dr. Morrison explained during a presentation at the National Wildlife Conference. Grace isn't just showing isolated instances of empathy. She appears to have undergone a lasting change in how she relates to other species. His presentation included thermal imaging, showing Grace's brain activity patterns, which revealed surprising similarities to those observed in mammals known for their emotional intelligence. The Thompsons, meanwhile, had become reluctant celebrities. Their story had captured the public's imagination, spawning countless articles, documentary requests, and even movie offers. Sarah Thompson used their newfound platform to advocate for wildlife protection, working closely with conservation groups to establish new guidelines for human-wildlife interaction. Casey's drawings of his time with Grace became the subject of intense study. Child psychologist Dr. Lisa Murray noticed something remarkable in their evolution. In his early drawings, Casey depicted Grace as simply big and brown, she noted. But as he continues to process the experience, his drawings show increasingly complex details. The way she positioned herself to block the wind, how she guided him to food sources. He's revealing details that align perfectly with the physical evidence we've found. The mystery of how Casey initially got lost deepened when investigators used advanced tracking technology to reconstruct his path. The data showed he had wandered nearly 4 miles from the campsite, an impossible distance given the terrain and his age. This led to a startling theory. Grace might have found him much closer to the campsite and deliberately moved him to a safer location. Dr. Chen's team made another breakthrough when they analyzed the soil samples from where Casey had slept. The area showed signs of deliberate preparation. Grace had apparently cleared sharp rocks and created a slight depression, lining it with softer materials. This kind of environmental manipulation for the benefit of another species had never been documented in wild bears. The international scientific community remained divided on the implications. Dr. Viktor Petrov, a renowned animal behaviorist from Moscow University, argued that Grace's behavior represented an evolutionary leap in ursine intelligence. Others, like Dr. Amanda Hughes from Cambridge, suggested that this level of emotional sophistication might have always been present in bears, but had gone unrecognized by researchers. The debate took an unexpected turn when primate researcher Dr. Jane Goodall weighed in. "What we're seeing with Grace," she stated in a viral video interview, "mirrors behaviors I've observed in chimpanzees who adopt and care for orphaned infants of other species. The capacity for cross-species empathy may be far more widespread in the animal kingdom than we've previously acknowledged." Local indigenous leaders offered their own perspective on Grace's behavior. "Our stories have always spoken of bears as teachers and protectors," Joseph Runningwolf explained. "Modern science is only now catching up to what our ancestors understood, that animals are capable of deep wisdom and compassion." As researchers continued to monitor Grace, they noticed she had begun creating what appeared to be safe zones throughout her territory, cleared areas similar to where she had kept Casey. It was as if she had appointed herself guardian of the forest, ready to offer sanctuary to any creature in need. This behavioral evolution suggested a level of premeditation that challenged existing theories about animal consciousness. The implications of Grace's behavior began rippling through wildlife conservation policy circles. The Montana State Wildlife Commission called an emergency session to review their bear management protocols. Traditional approaches to human-wildlife conflict suddenly seemed outdated in light of what they now knew about ursine intelligence and emotional capacity. "We can no longer justify blanket aggressive response policies," announced Commissioner Helen Martinez at a packed public hearing. "The Thompson Grace incident has shown us that these animals are capable of far more nuanced behavior than our current guidelines acknowledge." The Commission began drafting new protocols that would require detailed behavioral assessment before any intervention with wild bears. The revolution in bear management spread rapidly across North America. In Yellowstone, rangers implemented what they called the Grace Protocol, a new approach to bear encounters that prioritized understanding individual bear behavior patterns before taking action. The results were immediate and striking. Forced relocations dropped by 40% in the first 6 months. Dr. Catherine Chen's team made another breakthrough when they analyzed Grace's vocalizations during her time with Casey. Using advanced audio processing technology, they discovered patterns that closely matched the soothing sounds mother bears use with distressed cubs. "She wasn't just tolerating Casey," Dr. Chen explained. "She was actively trying to comfort him." The story caught the attention of world-renowned anthropologist Dr. Margaret Stanton. "Throughout human history, we've had myths about children being raised by wild animals," she noted in a TED Talk that quickly went viral. "We've always treated these as metaphorical stories, but the Grace incident forces us to consider how many of these legends might have been based on real events." Casey Thompson's 3rd birthday party became an unexpected focal point for this cultural shift. Held at the local community center, it attracted an unusual mix of guests: wildlife biologists, indigenous elders, park rangers, and of course, the media. Casey, still too young to understand his role in changing human-wildlife relations, was most excited about his bear-themed cake. Sarah Thompson used the occasion to announce the creation of the Grace Wildlife Foundation, dedicated to promoting understanding of animal intelligence and emotion. Our experience with Grace showed us that these animals are capable of extraordinary compassion, she told the assembled crowd. We have a responsibility to return that compassion. The Foundation's first project involved installing a network of advanced monitoring stations throughout Grace's territory. These solar-powered units could track not just movement, but also gather data on bear social interactions, vocalizations, and behavior patterns. The project quickly expanded as other research institutions contributed funding and technology. Perhaps the most surprising development came from the medical community. Dr. Rachel Weber, who had initially examined Casey, collaborated with neurologists to study the psychological implications of his experience. Their findings suggested that his time with Grace had affected his brain development in unexpected ways. Casey shows enhanced empathy and emotional intelligence compared to typical children his age, Dr. Weber reported. His ability to read nonverbal cues and respond to others' emotional states is remarkably advanced. This led to a new field of research exploring the developmental impacts of positive wild animal interactions. The international media continued to track Grace's activities with intense interest. When she was spotted leading another bear's cubs to safety after their mother was injured, the footage went viral globally. Grace had become more than just a local legend. She was changing how people worldwide thought about wild animals. Joseph, Running Wolf, and other tribal elders began receiving invitations to speak at major universities about traditional indigenous understanding of bear behavior. For generations, we were told our stories about intelligent, compassionate bears were just myths, Running Wolf said. Now science is proving what our ancestors always knew. The scientific community's understanding of animal intelligence underwent a seismic shift as research inspired by Grace expanded beyond bears to other species. The University of Montana established the Center for Cross-Species Emotional Intelligence, attracting researchers from disciplines ranging from neurobiology to ecological psychology. Dr. Elena Vasquez's team made a groundbreaking discovery when they analyzed Grace's DNA. They identified unique genetic markers associated with empathy and social bonding, similar to those found in highly social mammals like dolphins and elephants. What we're seeing suggests that the capacity for complex emotional behavior might be more widespread in the animal kingdom than we ever imagined, Dr. Vasquez explained. The implications reached far beyond academic circles. Wildlife photographers. David and Susan Chang spent 6 months documenting Grace's daily activities, capturing unprecedented footage of her interactions with other forest inhabitants. Their documentary, Grace, the Bear Who Changed Everything, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, winning the Grand Jury Prize and bringing the story to an even wider audience. Casey Thompson, now approaching his 4th birthday, began showing remarkable abilities that caught the attention of child development experts. His capacity to read animal body language and predict their behavior far exceeded what was typical for his age. Dr. Marcus Chen began a longitudinal study of what he termed the Grace effect on early childhood development. Casey's experience has literally rewired his brain, Dr. Chen explained during a presentation at Harvard Medical School. His neural pathways show enhanced activity in areas associated with empathy and nonverbal communication. It's as if his time with Grace activated dormant capabilities in human cognition. The research took an unexpected turn when scientists discovered that Grace wasn't unique. Reports began flowing in from around the world of similar, though less, dramatic instances of wild animals showing extraordinary empathy toward humans and other species. A tiger in India had been documented protecting a lost child for several hours. An elephant in Kenya had been observed comforting an injured antelope instead of attacking it. Dr. James Morrison developed a new theoretical framework he called cross-species emotional recognition, CSER. What we're discovering, he wrote in a landmark paper published in Nature, is that many animals possess an innate ability to recognize and respond to distress across species boundaries. This capacity has likely been present all along, but our preconceptions about wild animal behavior prevented us from seeing it. The Blackfeet tribe's wildlife management practices, based on centuries of traditional knowledge, suddenly found themselves at the forefront of modern conservation science. Joseph Running Wolf worked with wildlife biologists to develop new protocols that incorporated both scientific data and indigenous understanding of animal behavior. Our ancestors knew that bears were capable of great wisdom and compassion, Running Wolf explained during a UN Wildlife Conservation Summit. They left us stories about building relationships with the natural world based on mutual respect and understanding. Now, Grace has helped bridge the gap between traditional knowledge and modern science. The Grace Wildlife Foundation expanded its research to include a groundbreaking citizen science initiative. They developed a smartphone app that allowed hikers, campers, and outdoor enthusiasts to document and report instances of unusual animal behavior. Within months, they had collected thousands of reports that suggested intelligent, empathetic behavior was far more common in wild animals than previously believed. Sarah Thompson's advocacy work led to major policy changes in wildlife management across North America. The Grace Protocols became standard procedure in national parks, requiring wildlife officers to evaluate individual animal behavior patterns before taking any action. The results were remarkable. Human-wildlife conflicts decreased significantly as rangers learned to better understand and work with animal intelligence. As winter approached Montana again, Grace's territory had become a living laboratory for the study of animal consciousness. Research teams using non-invasive observation techniques documented complex social behaviors that challenged every existing theory about ursine intelligence. Grace had not only changed how we view bears, she had sparked a revolution in our understanding of the emotional lives of all wild animals. The educational impact of Grace's story spread through classrooms worldwide like wildfire. Elementary schools began incorporating what became known as the Grace curriculum, a new approach to teaching children about wildlife that emphasized emotional intelligence in animals. Children were fascinated by the idea that wild animals could show such complex emotions and decision-making abilities. The Montana State Education Board took the lead, implementing a pioneering program that brought wildlife experts into classrooms. Dr. Catherine Chen regularly visited Casey's preschool, where she used his experience to teach children about respecting and understanding wild animals. The results were remarkable. Incidents of wildlife harassment by young people in the area dropped to near zero. Children innately understand what we adults have forgotten, Dr. Chen observed during a teachers' conference. They accept that animals can be intelligent and emotional beings without the skepticism we've learned to apply. Casey's story helps them connect with that natural wisdom. Casey himself became an unwitting ambassador for this new understanding. Though his parents carefully managed his public exposure, his occasional appearances at educational events had a powerful impact. Other children were mesmerized by his stories about Grace, and his natural ability to interact with animals inspired a new generation of wildlife enthusiasts. The Thompsons received thousands of letters from children worldwide, many sharing their own stories of unexpected animal encounters. Sarah worked with child psychologists to create a series of illustrated books that help children understand wild animals in a new way. The first book, My Friend Grace, became an international bestseller and was translated into 27 languages. Meanwhile, Grace's influence on her own species continued to fascinate researchers. Other bears in her territory began exhibiting similar protective behaviors towards smaller animals. Dr. Vasquez's team documented several instances of bears intervening to prevent predator-prey conflicts, suggesting that Grace was actually teaching other bears her unique approach to interspecies interactions. We're witnessing the emergence of a new cultural pattern in this bear population, Dr. Vasquez explained in a paper published in Scientific American. Grace isn't just an anomaly, she's become a teacher, passing on her enhanced emotional intelligence to other bears in her community. The research caught the attention of renowned primatologist Jane Goodall, who made a special trip to Montana to observe Grace. After spending a week watching the bear's behavior, Goodall made a stunning declaration. In 50 years of studying animal behavior, I've never seen anything quite like this. Grace is demonstrating levels of emotional sophistication that rival those of our closest primate relatives. The Grace Wildlife Foundation expanded its educational outreach, creating virtual reality experiences that allowed students worldwide to safely encounter Grace and learn about bear behavior. The program became particularly popular in urban areas where children had little direct exposure to wildlife. Teachers reported that students showed increased empathy and environmental awareness after participating. Local tourism underwent a transformation as well. Instead of the traditional wildlife viewing approaches, tour operators developed new, empathy-based wildlife experiences. Visitors were taught to observe and understand animal behavior patterns rather than just taking photos. The approach proved so successful that it was adopted by national parks across North America. Mark Thompson, who had remained relatively quiet about his son's experience, finally spoke at a national park rangers convention. Before this happened, I saw bears as something to fear and avoid, he admitted. Grace taught us that there's so much more to these animals than we ever imagined. She didn't just save my son, she opened our eyes to a whole new way of seeing the natural world. The scientific implications continued to expand as researchers identified similar patterns of emotional intelligence in other species. A network of wildlife observation stations, modeled after those in Grace's territory, was established in protected areas worldwide. The data they collected suggested that complex emotional behavior in wild animals was far more common than previously believed. 1 year after Casey's rescue, Grace's territory had evolved into something unprecedented in wildlife studies. The bear had established what researchers called a neutral zone, an area where different species coexisted with remarkably low instances of predatory behavior. Trail cameras captured deer drinking from streams, while bears foraged nearby, neither species showing signs of aggression or fear. Dr. Elena Vasquez's team made a groundbreaking discovery when they analyzed the social dynamics within this zone. Grace has essentially created a new ecological paradigm, she reported. She actively mediates conflicts between species, using body language and vocalizations to maintain peace in her territory. It's like she's established a diplomatic zone in the wilderness. The implications for conservation were enormous. Traditional wildlife management had always focused on separating species to prevent conflict. Grace's territory demonstrated that, under the right conditions, different species could share space harmoniously. Wildlife managers from around the world came to study this phenomenon, hoping to replicate it in other protected areas. Perhaps, most remarkably, other bears began adopting Grace's behavioral patterns. Young bears, in particular, showed signs of learning from her example. Dr. James Morrison documented cases of juvenile bears displaying similar protective behaviors towards smaller animals. We're witnessing the emergence of a new cultural tradition. Among these bears, he explained, Grace isn't just an individual anomaly. She's becoming the founder of a new way of being. Casey Thompson's connection to Grace continued to evolve in unexpected ways. During supervised visits to the observation stations, he displayed an uncanny ability to predict bear behavior. He seems to understand their body language at an intuitive level, noted Dr. Marcus Chen. It's as if his time with Grace gave him a direct line into bear psychology. The Grace Wildlife Foundation launched an ambitious project to create a series of connected wildlife corridors based on Grace's territory model. The idea was to establish protected pathways where animals could travel and coexist with minimal human interference. The project received unexpected support from ranchers who had traditionally opposed wildlife protection measures. We've seen how Grace's presence actually reduces conflict between predators and livestock, explained local rancher Bill Henderson. When bears learn this kind of behavior, they're less likely to attack our cattle. It's a win-win situation. His testimony helped convince other ranchers to support the corridor project. Sarah Thompson's advocacy work reached new heights when she addressed the United Nations Environmental Assembly. Grace showed us that the divide between humans and wildlife isn't as wide as we thought, she told the gathered delegates. We need to protect not just individual species, but the spaces where different species can learn to coexist. The scientific community was forced to confront its own biases as more evidence of animal emotional intelligence emerged. Dr. Catherine Chen published a controversial paper suggesting that many species possessed untapped potential for emotional sophistication. What Grace demonstrated isn't just an isolated incident, she argued. It's evidence of capabilities that exist throughout the animal kingdom, waiting to be recognized and understood. Joseph Running Wolf and other tribal elders began working with wildlife biologists to document traditional knowledge about bear behavior. Their collaboration revealed numerous historical accounts of bears showing similar protective behaviors toward humans and other animals. These stories, once dismissed as legends, now provided valuable insights into ursine psychology. The impact on public policy was equally profound. The U.S. Forest Service revised its wildlife management guidelines to incorporate what they called Grace principles, approaches that recognized and worked with animal intelligence rather than against it. The new policies emphasized observation and understanding over immediate intervention in wildlife situations. As winter approached again, researchers noticed something extraordinary in Grace's territory. The bear had begun creating food caches, not just for herself, but apparently for other animals as well. She was observed deliberately leaving portions of her foraged food in accessible locations for smaller animals, displaying a level of resource sharing never before documented in wild bears. The revolution in wildlife rehabilitation began when Dr. Rachel Weber noticed something extraordinary about injured animals brought to her facility from Grace's territory. These animals showed markedly lower stress levels and adapted more quickly to human care than those from other areas. The discovery prompted a complete rethinking of wildlife rehabilitation practices. Animals from Grace's zone seem to understand that humans can help them, Dr. Weber explained during a veterinary conference. It's as if they've learned from her example that cross-species cooperation is possible. Her facility began implementing what they called the Grace Method, a rehabilitation approach that emphasized emotional connection alongside physical healing. The most striking example came when an injured wolf pup was found in Grace's territory. Trail cameras had captured remarkable footage of Grace guiding the limping pup to an area frequently patrolled by park rangers. The bear had even remained nearby until help arrived, behavior that left even seasoned wildlife experts speechless. Dr. Elena Vasquez's team made another breakthrough when they discovered that Grace's influence had spread beyond her immediate territory. Bears in neighboring areas began exhibiting similar nurturing behaviors toward other species. The phenomenon was particularly noticeable among female bears who had lost cubs, suggesting a redirection of maternal instincts. What we're seeing is the emergence of a new behavioral paradigm, Dr. Vasquez reported. These bears are developing a form of cross-species altruism that challenges everything we thought we knew about predator psychology. Her findings sparked intense debate in the scientific community about the potential for emotional evolution in wild animals. The Grace Wildlife Foundation established a network of rehabilitation centers based on these new principles. Instead of isolating injured animals, they created controlled environments where different species could interact under careful supervision. The results were remarkable. Recovery rates improved significantly, and released animals showed better adaptation to the wild. Casey Thompson, now approaching his 5th birthday, became an unofficial consultant for these centers. His unique insight into animal behavior, gained from his time with Grace, proved invaluable. Casey can read subtle changes in animal body, language that even experienced handlers miss, noted Dr. Marcus Chen. His experience with Grace seems to have activated an innate human capacity for animal communication. The implications for conservation were profound. Traditional wildlife management had focused on maintaining boundaries between species and between humans and animals. The success of the Grace method suggested a different approach might be possible, one based on fostering positive interactions rather than enforcing separation. Sarah Thompson's advocacy work led to the establishment of the first Grace zones in national parks across North America. These were designated areas where wildlife management focused on encouraging positive interactions between species. Rangers reported unprecedented success in reducing human-wildlife conflicts in these zones. Perhaps most remarkably, the behavioral changes began affecting how bears interacted with human settlements. In areas where Grace method principles were implemented, bears showed decreased aggression toward humans and livestock. They began exhibiting what researchers termed selective foraging, actively avoiding human food sources even when they were easily accessible. Dr. Catherine Chen documented this transformation in her groundbreaking study, The Grace Effect: Evolution of Ursine Social Intelligence. She argued that Grace had demonstrated bears' capacity for cultural learning and adaptation. What we're witnessing isn't just individual behavior change, she wrote. It's the emergence of a new cultural tradition among bears. Joseph Running Wolf and other tribal elders saw these developments as validation of traditional wisdom. Our ancestors understood that animals could be teachers, he explained during a wildlife management symposium. Grace is showing modern science what indigenous peoples have known for generations, that the natural world operates through cooperation as much as competition. The international impact of Grace's story reached new heights when the United Nations Environmental Program launched the Global Wildlife Intelligence Initiative. Inspired by the success of the Grace method, the program aimed to revolutionize wildlife protection policies worldwide. Representatives from 43 countries gathered in Geneva to establish new guidelines for human-wildlife interaction. Dr. James Morrison presented compelling evidence that Grace's behavioral patterns were not just spreading among bears, but influencing other large predator species as well. In Yellowstone, wolves began showing decreased aggression toward prey animals in areas where Grace method principles had been implemented. In India's Ranthambore National Park, tigers exhibited similar protective behaviors toward smaller animals. What we're witnessing is a cascade effect, Dr. Morrison explained to the assembled delegates. When we create environments that allow for positive interactions between species, animals appear to tap into latent capacities for empathy and cooperation. Grace didn't just change bear behavior. She showed us what's possible across the entire spectrum of wildlife. The Grace Wildlife Foundation partnered with National Geographic to create a groundbreaking documentary series. Using advanced filming techniques and non-invasive observation methods, they captured unprecedented footage of Grace's continuing influence on her ecosystem. The series, titled Grace's Legacy, became the most-watched wildlife documentary in streaming history. Casey Thompson's unique perspective continued to provide valuable insights. During a supervised visit to Grace's territory with Dr. Marcus, Chen, the now 5-year-old, made an observation that led to a significant breakthrough. He noticed subtle variations in bear vocalizations that had eluded even experienced researchers. Analysis of these sound patterns revealed a complex system of communication between bears and other species. Casey's connection with Grace gave him access to a level of understanding that most humans have lost, Dr. Chen wrote in his research paper. His observations suggest that humans may once have possessed a much deeper capacity for interspecies communication. Sarah Thompson used this discovery to advocate for new approaches to wildlife education. We need to stop teaching children to fear wild animals, she argued at an international education conference. Instead, we should be nurturing their natural ability to understand and connect with other species. Her proposal led to the development of innovative wildlife education programs in schools worldwide. The scientific implications expanded further when Dr. Elena Vasquez's team identified specific environmental factors that seemed to promote the development of cross-species empathy. They discovered that areas with reduced human interference and preserved natural corridors showed higher instances of cooperative behavior between different species. Grace's territory has become a living laboratory for the study of animal emotional intelligence, Dr. Vasquez reported. We're seeing behaviors that suggest these animals aren't just copying Grace. They're building on her example and developing new forms of interaction. Joseph Runningwolf worked with the Smithsonian Institution to create an archive of indigenous knowledge about animal behavior. The project revealed countless historical accounts of wild animals showing intelligence and empathy that paralleled Grace's behavior. These stories, combined with modern scientific observation, created a new framework for understanding wildlife behavior. The impact on wildlife rehabilitation practices continued to grow. Centers worldwide adopted the Grace method, reporting unprecedented success rates in treating and releasing injured animals. Most surprisingly, released animals often returned to their habitats, showing increased capacity for positive interactions with other species. Mark Thompson, who had remained relatively quiet about his son's experience, finally published a memoir titled What Grace Taught Us. The book offered intimate insights into how the experience had transformed his family's understanding of the natural world. Grace didn't just save my son, he wrote. She showed us a new way of seeing our relationship with wild animals. The study of animal consciousness underwent a paradigm shift when researchers from the Center for Cross-Species Emotional Intelligence made a startling discovery in Grace's territory. Using advanced neuroimaging technology, they detected patterns of brain activity in the local bear population that had never been observed before. These patterns showed remarkable similarities to those associated with empathy and social cognition in humans. Dr. Catherine Chen led a groundbreaking study using non-invasive brain scanning equipment specially designed for observing wild animals in their natural habitat. What we're seeing in these bears' neural activity suggests they're operating at a level of emotional sophistication that we previously thought impossible in non-primate species, she explained during a presentation at Oxford University. The most fascinating development came when researchers observed Grace appearing to actively teach younger bears. She would demonstrate specific behaviors, such as helping injured animals or sharing food resources, then watch as the younger bears attempted to replicate these actions. This kind of deliberate instruction had never been documented in wild bears before. "It's like watching the emergence of a new culture," noted Dr. Elena Vasquez. "Grace isn't just exhibiting these behaviors herself anymore. She's creating a legacy, passing on her understanding to the next generation." The implications for evolutionary biology were profound, suggesting that significant behavioral changes could occur within a single generation. Casey Thompson's connection to this phenomenon continued to provide valuable insights. During a carefully monitored visit to the observation station, he noticed subtle variations in the bears' teaching behaviors. "They do it different for different bears," he observed with a child's simple clarity. This led researchers to discover that the bears were actually adapting their teaching methods based on the personality and learning style of each individual student. The Grace Wildlife Foundation expanded its research to include studies of animal consciousness across different species. They discovered that animals in Grace's territory showed higher levels of what they termed cross-species emotional intelligence compared to similar species in other locations. Even smaller animals, from rabbits to birds, demonstrated more complex social behaviors and reduced fear responses. Sarah Thompson's advocacy work reached a new milestone when the United Nations adopted the Grace Protocols as part of international wildlife conservation standards. These guidelines emphasize the importance of recognizing and protecting animal emotional intelligence as a crucial factor in species preservation. "We can no longer treat wild animals as simple creatures driven purely by instinct," Sarah argued before the UN Assembly. "Grace has shown us that they are capable of complex emotional decisions and moral choices. Our conservation efforts must reflect this understanding." Dr. James Morrison's team made another breakthrough when they identified specific vocalizations that Grace used to communicate with different species. Using advanced audio analysis, they discovered that she had developed a sophisticated system of cross-species communication, adapting her sounds and body language to be understood by various animals. "It's not just that she's learned to communicate with other species," Dr. Morrison explained. "She's actually created a new form of interspecies dialogue. We're seeing other bears in her territory beginning to use similar communication patterns." The impact on wildlife rehabilitation continued to evolve. Centers using the Grace method reported that animals were not only recovering faster, but were showing increased capacity for positive interactions with both humans and other species after release. This led to the development of new protocols for wildlife rehabilitation that emphasized emotional healing alongside physical recovery. Joseph Running Wolf worked with wildlife biologists to document how Grace's behavior aligned with traditional indigenous knowledge about bear intelligence. "Our ancestors understood that bears could be teachers and healers," he explained. "Now we're seeing scientific proof of what our stories have always told us." The transformation of Grace's territory continued to surprise even seasoned researchers. They observed the emergence of what they called peace zones, areas where different species, including traditional predator and prey, would gather without aggressive interactions. These zones challenged fundamental assumptions about natural behavior and survival instincts. The implications of Grace's story extended far beyond wildlife biology when neuroscientists and consciousness researchers began studying the phenomenon. Dr. Marcus Chen collaborated with cognitive scientists from MIT to explore how Casey's experience with Grace had altered his brain's capacity for interspecies communication. Their findings challenged conventional theories about human consciousness and its limitations. What we're seeing in Casey's neural patterns suggests that humans may have dormant capabilities for animal communication, Dr. Chen reported at the International Conference on Consciousness Studies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His time with Grace seems to have activated neural pathways that most humans never develop. This discovery led to a new field of research exploring human potential for deeper connection with other species. The most surprising breakthrough came when researchers used advanced EEG equipment to simultaneously monitor Grace and other animals in her territory during their interactions. The data revealed synchronized brainwave patterns between different species during cooperative activities, suggesting a form of neural resonance that transcended species barriers. Dr. Rachel Weber, leading the neurological studies, made a startling observation. These animals aren't just cooperating on a behavioral level, their brains are literally syncing up during interactions. It's as if they've developed a shared consciousness that allows them to understand and predict each other's needs and intentions. Casey Thompson, now approaching his 6th birthday, participated in carefully designed studies that tested his ability to interpret animal behavior. His accuracy in predicting animal intentions and emotional states far exceeded what should have been possible based on conventional understanding of human capabilities. This led researchers to question whether all humans might possess similar, latent abilities. What Casey experienced with Grace may have awakened something that exists in all of us, theorized Dr. Elena Vasquez. Our ancient ancestors likely had much stronger connections with other species. Perhaps these abilities aren't lost, just dormant. The Grace Wildlife Foundation launched a pioneering research program exploring the possibility of enhancing human-animal communication. Using advanced biofeedback techniques and lessons learned from Grace's territory, they began developing methods to help humans tap into their innate capacity for interspecies understanding. Sarah Thompson's advocacy work took on a new dimension as she began speaking about the broader implications of Grace's story for human consciousness. We've been looking at consciousness as something that separates us from other species, she argued. What if it's actually the bridge that connects us? The scientific community was forced to confront its assumptions about the nature of intelligence itself. Dr. Catherine Chen's research showed that animals in Grace's territory exhibited forms of intelligence that didn't fit traditional metrics. We need to expand our definition of intelligence, she argued. These animals are showing us that emotional intelligence and social cooperation are just as important as problem-solving abilities. Joseph Runningwolf worked with neurologists to explore connections between traditional indigenous understanding of animal consciousness and the new scientific findings. Our ancestors knew that all beings share a common consciousness, he explained. Science is now finding the evidence to support this ancient wisdom. Perhaps most remarkably, researchers began documenting what appeared to be intentional teaching behaviors among various species in Grace's territory. Animals weren't just learning from Grace, they were passing knowledge on to others, creating a complex web of interspecies education that had never been observed before. What we're witnessing is the emergence of a new form of consciousness. Dr. James Morrison proposed in a landmark paper, not individual consciousness, not even collective consciousness within a species, but a true interspecies consciousness that transcends traditional boundaries. The implications of Grace's story extended far beyond wildlife biology, when neuroscientists and consciousness researchers began studying the phenomenon. Dr. Marcus Chen collaborated with cognitive scientists from MIT to explore how Casey's experience with Grace had altered his brain's capacity for interspecies communication. Their findings challenged conventional theories about human consciousness and its limitations. What we're seeing in Casey's neural patterns suggests that humans may have dormant capabilities for animal communication, Dr. Chen reported at the International Conference on Consciousness Studies. His time with Grace seems to have activated neural pathways that most humans never develop. This discovery led to a new field of research exploring human potential for deeper connection with other species. The most surprising breakthrough came when researchers used advanced EEG equipment to simultaneously monitor Grace and other animals in her territory during their interactions. The data revealed synchronized brainwave patterns between different species during cooperative activities, suggesting a form of neural resonance that transcended species barriers. Dr. Rachel Weber, leading the neurological studies, made a startling observation. These animals aren't just cooperating on a behavioral level, their brains are literally syncing up during interactions. It's as if they've developed a shared consciousness that allows them to understand and predict each other's needs and intentions. Casey Thompson, now approaching his 6th birthday, participated in carefully designed studies that tested his ability to interpret animal behavior. His accuracy in predicting animal intentions and emotional states far exceeded what should have been possible based on conventional understanding of human capabilities. This led researchers to question whether all humans might possess similar, latent abilities. What Casey experienced with Grace may have awakened something that exists in all of us, theorized Dr. Elena Vasquez. Our ancient ancestors likely had much stronger connections with other species. Perhaps these abilities aren't lost, just dormant. The Grace Wildlife Foundation launched a pioneering research program exploring the possibility of enhancing human-animal communication. Using advanced biofeedback techniques and lessons learned from Grace's territory, they began developing methods to help humans tap into their innate capacity for interspecies understanding. Sarah Thompson's advocacy work took on a new dimension as she began speaking about the broader implications of Grace's story for human consciousness. We've been looking at consciousness as something that separates us from other species, she argued. What if it's actually the bridge that connects us? The scientific community was forced to confront its assumptions about the nature of intelligence itself. Dr. Catherine Chen's research showed that animals in Grace's territory exhibited forms of intelligence that didn't fit traditional metrics. We need to expand our definition of intelligence, she argued. These animals are showing us that emotional intelligence and social cooperation are just as important as problem-solving abilities. Joseph Running-Wolf worked with neurologists to explore connections between traditional indigenous understanding of animal consciousness and the new scientific findings. Our ancestors knew that all beings share a common consciousness, he explained. Science is now finding the evidence to support this ancient wisdom. Perhaps most remarkably, researchers began documenting what appeared to be intentional teaching behaviors among various species in Grace's territory. Animals weren't just learning from Grace, they were passing knowledge on to others, creating a complex web of interspecies education that had never been observed before. What we're witnessing is the emergence of a new form of consciousness. Dr. James Morrison proposed in a landmark paper, not individual consciousness, not even collective consciousness within a species, but a true interspecies consciousness that transcends traditional boundaries. The revolution in human understanding of animal consciousness reached a turning point when Grace's territory began expanding naturally, not through her own movement, but through the spread of her influence. Wildlife observers documented how animals from neighboring areas were deliberately seeking out her territory, creating what researchers called consciousness corridors, paths of changed behavior that radiated outward from Grace's original domain. Dr. Elena Vasquez's team mapped this remarkable expansion using satellite tracking and ground observations. We're seeing something unprecedented, she reported. Animals are actively choosing to enter Grace's territory, learning new behaviors, and then, returning to their own habitats to spread these practices. It's like watching the viral spread of consciousness itself. The most fascinating aspect was how this behavioral evolution affected different species differently. Predators entering Grace's territory learned to moderate their hunting instincts, while prey species developed more sophisticated cooperative behaviors. Yet both groups maintained healthy population numbers, challenging traditional assumptions about survival requirements. Casey Thompson's unique connection to this phenomenon provided new insights when he participated in a carefully documented visit to one of the new consciousness corridors. Without any prior information, he correctly identified which animals had been influenced by Grace's teaching and which were newcomers. "They have different lights in their eyes," he explained simply, leading researchers to discover subtle changes in eye movement patterns among animals exposed to Grace's influence. The Grace Wildlife Foundation established observation posts along these corridors, creating the first systematic study of how animal consciousness could spread through wild populations. Their findings suggested that animals weren't just copying behaviors, they were adapting and innovating, creating new forms of interspecies cooperation that even Grace hadn't demonstrated. Dr. Catherine Chen's research revealed something even more remarkable. The changes weren't limited to behavior. "We're seeing physiological changes in animals from Grace's territory," she reported. "Stress hormone levels are lower, immune function is improved, and brain scans show enhanced activity in areas associated with empathy and social cognition." Sarah Thompson used these findings to advocate for a complete overhaul of wildlife management practices. "We need to stop thinking about animal populations as something to be controlled," she argued at a UN wildlife conference. "Instead, we should be creating conditions that allow this natural evolution of consciousness to spread." The scientific implications expanded further when researchers discovered that even plants in Grace's territory showed changes. Dr. James Morrison collaborated with botanists to document how trees and other plants in the area demonstrated increased chemical communication and resource sharing. "It's as if the entire ecosystem is becoming more cooperative," he noted. Joseph Runningwolf worked with the research teams to document how these changes aligned with traditional indigenous knowledge about ecosystem consciousness. "Our ancestors understood that all living things are connected through a web of awareness," he explained. "What we're seeing in Grace's territory is the reawakening of these ancient connections." The impact on human visitors to the area was equally profound. People who spent time observing the animals in Grace's territory reported increased feelings of connection with nature and enhanced ability to read animal behavior. Dr. Marcus Chen began studying these effects, documenting what he called consciousness contagion, the way human observers seemed to naturally attune to the higher level of awareness present in the area. Mark Thompson, who had remained cautious about public appearances, finally agreed to lead small groups of visitors through the consciousness corridors. "What changed my mind," he explained, "was seeing how these visits transformed people's understanding of wild animals. They come expecting to see interesting behavior, but they leave with a completely new perspective on consciousness itself." The transformation of human-wildlife relationships in areas touched by Grace's influence led to unexpected practical benefits. Communities near the consciousness corridors reported dramatic decreases in human-wildlife conflicts. Animals seemed to naturally avoid human settlements unless seeking help, and humans developed more nuanced understanding of animal behavior patterns. The impact of Grace's legacy on global environmental policy reached a watershed moment when the International Wildlife Conservation Summit convened in Stockholm. Representatives from 192 countries gathered to discuss what became known as the Grace Paradigm, a revolutionary approach to conservation that emphasized protecting not just individual species, but the conscious connections between them. Dr. Elena Vasquez presented compelling evidence that traditional wildlife corridors, when designed according to Grace principles, could become channels for the spread of enhanced animal consciousness. "We're not just protecting migration routes," she explained to the assembled delegates. "We're creating pathways for the evolution of animal intelligence and cooperation." The most dramatic demonstration of this principle came from Yellowstone National Park, where officials had implemented the first large-scale application of Grace-inspired conservation methods. Within 18 months, they documented remarkable changes in wolf pack behavior. The wolves began exhibiting protective behaviors toward injured elk calves, something previously thought impossible. Casey Thompson, whose unique insights continued to prove valuable, visited Yellowstone with Dr. Marcus Chen. Now 6 years old, he observed something that had eluded the researchers. The wolves weren't just protecting elk calves, they were actively teaching this behavior to their pups. "They're making sure the baby wolves know it's right," he explained, leading to the discovery of sophisticated teaching behaviors in wolf packs. The Grace Wildlife Foundation launched an ambitious global initiative called Consciousness Mapping, using satellite technology and ground observations to track the spread of enhanced animal awareness across continents. They discovered that once established, these networks of conscious behavior could jump geographical barriers, appearing in isolated populations that somehow seemed to tap into the larger pattern. Dr. Catherine Chen's research team made a breakthrough in understanding how this consciousness spread worked. Using advanced neuroimaging techniques, they discovered that animals exposed to Grace's influence developed enhanced mirror neuron systems, brain structures associated with empathy and learning. "These changes appear to be permanent and hereditary," she reported. "We're witnessing real-time evolution of neural architecture." Sarah Thompson used these findings to advocate for a new approach to endangered species protection. "We need to stop thinking about species in isolation," she argued before the UN Environmental Assembly. "The key to survival isn't just preserving numbers, it's protecting and nurturing these emerging networks of cross-species consciousness." The scientific community was forced to reconsider fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence when researchers documented what appeared to be deliberate problem-solving conferences between different species in Grace's territory. Bears, wolves, and even smaller animals would gather in neutral areas, seemingly to work out territory and resource-sharing arrangements. Joseph Runningwolf worked with international indigenous leaders to create a global database of traditional knowledge about animal consciousness. "What we're seeing now," he explained, "is the scientific validation of wisdom our peoples have. Carried for thousands of years, the animals are remembering who they truly are." Mark Thompson's guided tours of the consciousness corridors evolved into what he called awareness immersion experiences. Participants reported profound shifts in their understanding of animal intelligence. "People come expecting to observe animals," he noted, "but they end up discovering new aspects of their own consciousness." The practical applications of Grace's legacy expanded into unexpected areas. Wildlife rehabilitation centers worldwide adopted protocols based on the consciousness network model, reporting unprecedented success rates in releasing animals back into the wild. The key was ensuring that released animals could connect with the existing consciousness networks in their new territories. Perhaps most remarkably, researchers began documenting what appeared to be intentional expansion of consciousness networks. By the animals themselves, Grace's original territory had become a hub from which animals would deliberately venture out to establish new consciousness corridors, creating an ever-growing web of enhanced awareness across the landscape. The transformation of human society's relationship with nature took an unexpected turn when universities worldwide began reporting a strange phenomenon. Students spending time in grace-influenced territories were showing enhanced abilities to communicate with animals in other locations. This grace effect, as it came to be known, suggested that human consciousness itself could be permanently altered through exposure to these evolved animal awareness networks. Dr. Marcus Chen led a groundbreaking study at Stanford University, tracking these changes in human participants. What we're seeing isn't just increased empathy or better observation skills, he reported. These individuals are developing what appears to be a new form of sensory awareness, an ability to directly perceive the emotional states and intentions of animals. Casey Thompson, now entering first grade, became the subject of intense scientific interest when researchers discovered that his classmates were beginning to display similar abilities. "It's like Casey's consciousness acts as a bridge," explained Dr. Rachel Weber. "His presence seems to help others access these dormant capabilities for animal communication." The most significant breakthrough came when the Grace Wildlife Foundation collaborated with neuroscientists to study the brain patterns of people who had spent significant time in Grace's territory. They discovered the activation of neural pathways previously thought dormant in modern humans, pathways that matched patterns found in ancient human brain specimens. Sarah Thompson's advocacy work evolved to address this new dimension of human-animal connection. "We're not just protecting wildlife," she explained during a TED Talk that went viral. "We're rediscovering lost aspects of human consciousness that could be crucial for our species' future." Her presentation included remarkable footage of young children spontaneously communicating with wild animals in grace-influenced areas. The scientific implications expanded further when Dr. Elena Vasquez's team documented what they termed consciousness cascades, rapid spreads of enhanced awareness that could jump between species and even affect human observers. These cascades seemed to follow invisible networks of connection that transcended traditional ecological boundaries. Joseph Runningwolf worked with educators to develop a new curriculum that integrated traditional indigenous understanding of animal consciousness with the latest scientific discoveries. "What Grace started," he observed, "is helping us remember ancient ways of knowing that humans once shared with all living beings." The impact on conservation efforts was profound. Protected areas that implemented grace-inspired management practices reported unprecedented success in wildlife recovery and ecosystem restoration. More significantly, human communities near these areas began showing marked changes in their relationship with the natural world. Dr. Catherine Chen's research revealed that children growing up near grace-influenced territories displayed significant differences in brain development compared to those in urban areas. These children developed neural networks specifically adapted for processing non-human forms of communication, she reported. "It's as if their brains are evolving to reconnect with the natural world." Mark Thompson, observing these changes through his guided tours, noted a fascinating pattern. People who spend time here don't just learn about animals, they begin to experience the world in a fundamentally different way. It's like they're waking up to a level of reality that's always been there, just beyond our normal perception. The Grace Wildlife Foundation established the first consciousness recovery centers, facilities designed to help people reconnect with their innate ability to communicate with animals. These centers, combining scientific research with practical experience, quickly had waiting lists years long as people sought to develop these rediscovered capabilities. Perhaps most remarkably, researchers began documenting cases of spontaneous Animal-human cooperation in areas far from Grace's original territory. Wild animals would seek out human help when injured, and humans would report intuitive understanding of animals' needs. These interactions suggested that the consciousness network was expanding far beyond its original boundaries, creating a new paradigm of human-animal coexistence. The concept of collective consciousness underwent a radical transformation when researchers at the Center for Cross-Species Communication made an unprecedented discovery. Using quantum sensors originally designed for deep space observation, they detected coherent energy patterns linking all living beings within Grace-influenced territories. These patterns suggested the emergence of what Dr. James Morrison termed a unified field of consciousness. What we're observing goes beyond individual awareness, Dr. Morrison explained at a packed conference in Geneva. These territories are developing a shared consciousness that encompasses all species, including humans who enter the area. It's as if Grace initiated a reformation of the very fabric of consciousness itself. Casey Thompson's role in understanding this phenomenon deepened when researchers noticed that he could accurately map these consciousness fields without any technological assistance. During a supervised study, he drew patterns of connection between different species that perfectly matched the quantum sensor readings. The animals are all talking to each other, he explained simply, not with words, but with their hearts. The Grace Wildlife Foundation launched an ambitious project called Consciousness Mapping, using a combination of advanced technology and intuitive observers like Casey to track the spread of these unified fields. They discovered that these fields were not confined by physical boundaries, but could jump across continents, creating what they called consciousness bridges between distant ecosystems. Dr. Elena Vasquez's team made a breakthrough when they identified what appeared to be consciousness hub points, locations where the unified field was particularly strong. These points, they discovered, often corresponded with sites that indigenous peoples had long considered sacred. We're finding scientific evidence for ancient spiritual understanding, Dr. Vasquez noted. Sarah Thompson's advocacy work entered a new phase when she began working with international organizations to protect these consciousness hub points. These aren't just ecologically important areas, she argued before UNESCO. They're crucial nodes in Earth's emerging consciousness network. Protecting them is essential for the continued evolution of all species, including humans. The scientific community was forced to grapple with implications that challenged the foundations of materialist science. Dr. Catherine Chen's research showed that the unified consciousness field had measurable effects on physical reality, influencing everything from plant growth rates to weather patterns in affected areas. Joseph Running-Wolf worked with quantum physicists to explore connections between traditional indigenous understanding of universal consciousness and the new scientific findings. Our ancestors knew that all things are connected in the great web of life, he explained. Now we can see and measure these connections. The impact on human society was profound. Communities near consciousness hub points reported dramatic changes in social behavior, reduced crime rates, increased cooperation, and spontaneous emergence of sustainable practices. Dr. Marcus Chen began studying these effects, documenting what he called consciousness spillover into human social systems. Mark Thompson's guided tours evolved into what he called consciousness immersion experiences. Participants reported life-changing shifts in perception, describing experiences of unity with all life forms. People come here looking for a nature experience, he noted, but they find something much more profound, a remembrance of humanity's place in the greater web of consciousness. Perhaps most remarkably, researchers began documenting what appeared to be intentional expansion of the unified field by animals themselves. Species from Grace's territory would deliberately venture into new areas, establishing new consciousness, hub points, and expanding the network of awareness. Grace herself, though aging, continued to serve as a focal point for this expanding consciousness revolution. Researchers observed her spending more time in meditation-like states, during which the strength of the unified field would intensify. It was as if she had evolved from a teacher of individual animals to a custodian of emerging planetary consciousness. The transformation of humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world reached a critical turning point when the United Nations convened an unprecedented joint session of scientists, indigenous leaders, and wildlife experts. The agenda was ambitious: to redefine human civilization's relationship with nature based on the lessons learned from Grace's legacy. Dr. Elena Vasquez presented compelling evidence that human societies located near consciousness hub points were naturally evolving more sustainable practices. These communities aren't just making conscious choices to be more ecological, she explained. They're unconsciously aligning with the natural rhythms of their ecosystems. It's as if the enhanced consciousness field is guiding human behavior toward harmony with nature. Casey Thompson, now 7 years old, made a remarkable contribution to this understanding during a carefully documented visit to one of these communities. He observed that people living within the consciousness field moved differently. Their gestures and movements naturally avoided disturbing local wildlife. Further research revealed that these communities had unconsciously adopted what researchers termed ecosystem harmonious behavior patterns. The Grace Wildlife Foundation expanded its research to study these emerging human-nature relationships. They discovered that children born in consciousness hub zones showed extraordinary abilities to interact with the natural world. These children could intuitively understand weather patterns, predict animal behavior, and even sense coming environmental changes. Dr. Catherine Chen's team made a breakthrough when they identified specific changes in human brain structure among people living in these zones. We're seeing the development of new neural pathways, she reported. These changes suggest that human biology is actively evolving in response to the enhanced consciousness field. Sarah Thompson used these findings to advocate for a new approach to urban development. We need to stop seeing cities as separate from nature, she argued. The consciousness network shows us how human habitats can be integrated into the larger web of life. Her proposals led to the development of new urban planning principles that incorporated consciousness hub points into city designs. The scientific implications expanded further when researchers discovered that the consciousness field was influencing human technological development. Communities within the field showed a tendency to innovate in more environmentally harmonious ways, developing what Dr. James Morrison called naturally inspired technologies. Joseph Runningwolf worked with urban planners to incorporate traditional indigenous wisdom into these new development patterns. Our ancestors understood how to live in harmony with the consciousness of the land, he explained. Now we're remembering these ancient ways through a modern lens. Mark Thompson observed a fascinating pattern among visitors to Grace's territory who returned to their urban homes. They don't just take memories back with them, he noted. They take a piece of the enhanced consciousness, creating new nodes in the network wherever they go. It's like watching humanity remember its original relationship with nature. The practical applications of these discoveries led to the establishment of consciousness integration centers in major cities worldwide. These centers, designed around artificial consciousness hub points, helped urban dwellers reconnect with the natural world's unified field of awareness. Perhaps most remarkably, researchers began documenting what appeared to be spontaneous emergence of new consciousness hub points in highly urbanized areas. Grace's influence had sparked a chain reaction that was gradually transforming human consciousness on a global scale. The cultural revolution sparked by Grace's legacy reached a pivotal moment when artists, musicians, and creators worldwide began reporting extraordinary experiences within the consciousness zones. They described accessing a deeper layer of creativity that seemed to connect them directly to the natural world's own creative force. Dr. Marcus Chen's research team documented how exposure to the consciousness field enhanced human artistic expression. "We're seeing a new form of creativity emerging," he reported. "These artists aren't just depicting nature, they're channeling its consciousness into their work." Art galleries began featuring exhibitions created within Grace's territory, works that viewers reported could trigger experiences of connection with the natural world. Casey Thompson's own artistic expressions became the subject of intense interest. His drawings, now more sophisticated at age 7, captured complex patterns of interconnection that scientists later verified through quantum measurements. "I just draw what the animals show me," he explained, producing artwork that somehow managed to visualize the invisible threads of the consciousness network. The Grace Wildlife Foundation established the first Art and Nature Consciousness Center, where artists could spend time creating while immersed in the enhanced awareness field. The results were extraordinary: music that induced states of natural harmony, paintings that seemed to pulse with living energy, and poetry that could evoke direct experiences of animal consciousness in its readers. Dr. Elena Vasquez made a groundbreaking discovery when she analyzed the brainwave patterns of artists working within consciousness zones. Their neural activity synchronizes not just with other humans, but with the entire ecosystem, she reported. "It's as if they're tapping into Earth's own creative process." Sarah Thompson used these findings to advocate for a new approach to cultural preservation. "Art isn't just human expression," she argued at a UNESCO conference. "It's part of the planet's larger creative consciousness. We need to protect and nurture these emerging forms of cross-species creativity." The impact on global popular culture was profound. Musicians began incorporating animal songs and natural rhythms into their compositions in ways that respected and enhanced the consciousness network. Filmmakers developed new techniques to capture and convey the experience of unified awareness. Writers reported accessing stories that seemed to come directly from the natural world. Joseph Runningwolf worked with cultural institutions to document how this new artistic movement aligned with traditional indigenous creative practices. "Our ancestors created art in partnership with nature's consciousness," he explained. "Now, all of humanity is remembering this ancient way of creative collaboration." The scientific community was fascinated to discover that art created within consciousness zones had measurable effects on human neural activity. Dr. Catherine Chen's research showed that exposure to these works could temporarily enhance people's ability to perceive the unified field, even in urban environments far from natural consciousness hubs. Mark Thompson observed how visitors to Grace's territory increasingly reported spontaneous creative breakthroughs. "People arrive as observers and leave as creators," he noted. "Something about this enhanced consciousness awakens the artistic spirit in everyone it touches." Grace herself seemed to be evolving into something beyond a mere catalyst for change. Researchers observed her spending long periods in what appeared to be deep meditation, during which nearby artists reported experiencing profound creative insights. It was as if she had become a living channel for Earth's creative consciousness. As Grace entered her 15th year, researchers began noticing unprecedented changes in her behavior and influence. The aging bear spent increasingly longer periods in what Dr. Elena Vasquez termed consciousness broadcasting states, periods when the unified field around her territory reached extraordinary levels of intensity and coherence. What we're witnessing isn't decline, Dr. Vasquez explained to a gathering of international scientists. It's transcendence. Grace appears to be evolving beyond physical interaction into something we can barely comprehend. Measurements showed that during these states, the consciousness field emanating from her location could be detected at distances previously thought impossible. Casey Thompson, now 8 years old, was the first to understand what was happening. During a monitored visit to Grace's territory, he sat quietly observing her for several hours before announcing, "She's teaching everyone at once now, not just the animals here, everywhere." Subsequent research confirmed that Grace's influence had indeed begun reaching consciousness networks globally. The Grace Wildlife Foundation documented a remarkable phenomenon. Animals thousands of miles away were beginning to exhibit behaviors first observed in Grace's territory. Reports came in from Africa, Asia, and South America of predator species, spontaneously displaying protective behaviors toward other animals. The consciousness revolution had gone global. Dr. Catherine Chen's team made a stunning discovery when they analyzed the quantum patterns of Grace's broadcasts. "She's not just sharing information," Dr. Chen reported. "She's encoding the entire history of her journey, every insight, every lesson, every step of the consciousness evolution she initiated. It's like she's creating a blueprint for planetary awakening." Sarah Thompson worked tirelessly to ensure this final phase of Grace's work would be protected and understood. "What we're witnessing isn't an ending," she explained to world leaders at an emergency environmental summit. "It's the beginning of a new chapter in Earth's conscious evolution, and we have a responsibility to protect and nurture this process." The scientific implications expanded beyond anything researchers had imagined. During Grace's broadcasting, states observers noted that even plant life seemed to respond, with trees and flowers orienting themselves toward her location regardless of sun position. The unified field had begun influencing physical matter in ways that challenged fundamental laws of nature. Joseph Running Wolf and other indigenous leaders gathered at Grace's territory to conduct ceremonies that their traditions had predicted would be necessary at such a time. "Our ancestors spoke of a great awakening that would begin with a bear teacher," he explained. "They left us instructions for helping this consciousness seed take root across the world." Mark Thompson, who had witnessed the very beginning of Grace's journey with his son Casey, observed the profound symmetry of this final phase. "She began by saving one small boy," he reflected, "and now she's showing all of humanity a way to save itself through reconnection with the natural world." The practical effects of Grace's enhanced broadcasting became evident as consciousness hub points began appearing spontaneously around the world. These nodes of heightened awareness seemed to activate dormant potential in local ecosystems, accelerating the spread of enhanced consciousness among all species. Most remarkably, researchers discovered that humans and animals entering these new consciousness zones began experiencing shared visions, direct transmissions of Grace's original experience with Casey. It was as if she had found a way to share the spark that had initiated her own transformation, creating a self-perpetuating network of awakening that would continue long after her physical form was gone. In the end, Grace's physical departure from the world was as extraordinary as her life had been. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the day she had first found Casey, researchers observed her making one final journey to the clearing where it all began. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath as she settled into her last meditation. Dr. Elena Vasquez and her team recorded unprecedented levels of consciousness field activity during these final hours. What we witnessed wasn't death in any conventional sense, she later wrote. It was more like a transformation, as if Grace's individual consciousness had found a way to merge permanently with the unified field she helped create. Casey Thompson, now 9, insisted on being present for this final transition. As Grace's physical form began to still, he walked calmly to her side and placed his hand on her massive head. Observers reported seeing a visible pulse of energy ripple through the forest at that moment, as if decades of accumulated wisdom were being released into the consciousness network all at once. "She's not leaving," Casey explained to the tearful observers. "She's becoming everything." Subsequent measurements confirmed his insight. The consciousness field didn't diminish with Grace's physical passing, but instead grew stronger, as if her awareness had indeed expanded to encompass the entire network she had helped create. The Grace Wildlife Foundation documented extraordinary phenomena in the days following her transition. Animals from miles around made pilgrimages to the clearing, each spending time in silent communion at the spot where she had last rested. More remarkably, similar gatherings were reported at consciousness hub points around the world, as if Grace's final teaching was being shared globally. Dr. Catherine Chen's research team made a breakthrough when they analyzed the quantum patterns during these gatherings. "The animals aren't mourning," she reported. "They're participating in something like a graduation ceremony, a celebration of consciousness evolution reaching a new phase." Grace's last gift was showing them how individual awareness can expand to become universal. Sarah Thompson established the Grace Legacy Project, dedicated to protecting and studying the continuing evolution of the consciousness network. Grace showed us that consciousness isn't limited by physical form, she explained at the project's launch. Her work continues through every being that has been touched by this awakening. The scientific community was forced to expand its understanding of life and death as the consciousness field continued to grow stronger. Dr. James Morrison proposed a new theory of consciousness persistence, the idea that highly evolved awareness could transcend physical boundaries and continue to influence the material world. Joseph Running-Wolf worked with both scientists and spiritual leaders to document this new understanding of consciousness evolution. "Grace completed a circle," he explained. "She showed us how individual beings can awaken to their universal nature, and in doing so, help awaken others." Mark Thompson, reflecting on the journey that began with his son's rescue, observed how perfectly it had all unfolded. "We thought Grace had saved Casey's life," he said, "but really, she was initiating a process that would help save all life on Earth. Casey's innocence and her wisdom combined to spark a planetary awakening." As the years passed, Grace's influence continued to grow through the consciousness network she had established. New generations of all species were born, carrying the enhanced awareness she had initiated. Humans and animals continued to evolve toward more harmonious ways of coexisting, guided by the lessons she had embedded in the unified field. Casey Thompson, growing up alongside this evolution, became its leading interpreter. "Grace showed us that love isn't limited by species or form," he would often say. "She taught us that consciousness is the force that connects all life, and that by awakening to this truth, we can create a world where all beings thrive together in harmony." And so, what began as a simple act of compassion between a bear and a lost boy became a catalyst for planetary transformation, proving that the greatest changes often start with the smallest acts of kindness, and that consciousness, once awakened, knows no bounds in its power to transform the world. In the end, Grace's physical departure from the world was as extraordinary as her life had been. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the day she had first found Casey, researchers observed her making one final journey to the clearing where it all began. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath as she settled into her last meditation. Dr. Elena Vasquez and her team recorded unprecedented levels of consciousness field activity during these final hours. What we witnessed wasn't death in any conventional sense, she later wrote. It was more like a transformation, as if Grace's individual consciousness had found a way to merge permanently with the unified field she helped create. Casey Thompson, now 9, insisted on being present for this final transition. As Grace's physical form began to still, he walked calmly to her side and placed his hand on her massive head. Observers reported seeing a visible pulse of energy ripple through the forest at that moment, as if decades of accumulated wisdom were being released into the consciousness network all at once. "She's not leaving," Casey explained to the tearful observers. "She's becoming everything." Subsequent measurements confirmed his insight. The consciousness field didn't diminish with Grace's physical passing, but instead grew stronger, as if her awareness had indeed expanded to encompass the entire network she had helped create. The Grace Wildlife Foundation documented extraordinary phenomena in the days following her transition. Animals from miles around made pilgrimages to the clearing, each spending time in silent communion at the spot where she had last rested. More remarkably, similar gatherings were reported at consciousness hub points around the world, as if Grace's final teaching was being shared globally. Dr. Catherine Chen's research team made a breakthrough when they analyzed the quantum patterns during these gatherings. "The animals aren't mourning," she reported. "They're participating in something like a graduation ceremony, a celebration of consciousness evolution reaching a new phase." Grace's last gift was showing them how individual awareness can expand to become universal. Sarah Thompson established the Grace Legacy Project, dedicated to protecting and studying the continuing evolution of the consciousness network. "Grace showed us that consciousness isn't limited by physical form," she explained. At the project's launch, her work continues through every being that has been touched by this awakening. The scientific community was forced to expand its understanding of life and death as the consciousness field continued to grow stronger. Dr. James Morrison proposed a new theory of consciousness persistence, the idea that highly evolved awareness could transcend physical boundaries and continue to influence the material world. Joseph Runningwolf worked with both scientists and spiritual leaders to document this new understanding of consciousness evolution. "Grace completed a circle," he explained. "She showed us how individual beings can awaken to their universal nature and, in doing so, help awaken others." Mark Thompson, reflecting on the journey that began with his son's rescue, observed how perfectly it had all unfolded. "We thought Grace had saved Casey's life," he said, "but really she was initiating a process that would help save all life on Earth. Casey's innocence and her wisdom combined to spark a planetary awakening." As the years passed, Grace's influence continued to grow through the consciousness network she had established. New generations of all species were born carrying the enhanced awareness she had initiated. Humans and animals continued to evolve toward more harmonious ways of coexisting, guided by the lessons she had embedded in the unified field. Casey Thompson, growing up alongside this evolution, became its leading interpreter. "Grace showed us that love isn't limited by species or form," he would often say. "She taught us that consciousness is the force that connects all life, and that by awakening to this truth, we can create a world where all beings thrive together in harmony." And so, what began as a simple act of compassion between a bear and a lost boy became a catalyst for planetary transformation, proving that the greatest changes often start with the smallest acts of kindness, and that consciousness, once awakened, knows no bounds in its power to transform the world. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.